Okay, and I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So thank you for joining us today for the Connecticut Historical Society Lunch and Learn, Connecticut Political Figures and the Chinese Exclusion Act. Today's program supports our current exhibition, Journeys, Boys from the Chinese Educational Mission, which is open until July 30th. So we do hope you can come visit this amazing exhibition. If you can't, if you're out of range of getting to us, we also have a virtual tour of this exhibition on our website, chs.org. Our presenter today is Judge Henry Cohn, and he will discuss his research on the opposition to the Chinese Exclusion Acts by 2 Connecticut senators and 1 Massachusetts senator. Judge Cohn was appointed as a judge of the Connecticut Superior Court in 1997 and is now a judge trial referee. He served previously as Connecticut's Deputy Secretary of the State and briefly as the Secretary of the State, as well as an Assistant Attorney General. And he is the co-author of a legal history of the Hartford Circus Fire entitled The Great Hartford Circus Fire, Creative Settlement of Mass Disasters. And he has written and spoken on a variety of topics. So we're so glad you're here, Judge Cohn. Welcome. I'm going to go ahead and let a few more people in the room, and then I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and you can get started. And let me just get this. Here we go. All right. I'm all set whenever you're ready.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer was kind enough to arrange this program to give me a nice introduction. And she has put together some slides that she's going to show periodically during our talk. So I thank her very much for going to beyond the call of duty here to get things arranged. My topic today is something passed by the U.S. Congress called the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's not a recent law. It dates from 1882, passed by both houses of Congress and signed by our president. And actually, I'm not going to focus on those that wanted the Chinese Exclusion Act, that supported it, that introduced it, that voted for it. I'm going to talk about those that oppose the Chinese Exclusion Act, especially 2 senators from Connecticut and another fellow from a U.S. senator from Massachusetts that I'm kind of adopting as a Connecticut person. I'll tell you why in a minute. So I'm going to talk about the opposition. The opposition never won, never was able to overcome the strong push for exclusion, which meant that the Chinese were barred from coming to the United States. Well, I'm going to talk about those that tried to stop that bar. They weren't successful, but many of their ideas, many of the principles they stated in their opposition, I'm going to try and give you some examples of that, caught on and were the basis for repealing the Chinese. These Chinese Exclusion Acts were all repealed during World War II in 1943. So I'll tell you something about how that came to be as well. Now, the only thing I would say, though, is that, again, this is old history, but it's not so old history when you think of even current today when we talk about immigration, because this was the first time, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first time in American history that people were barred from coming to our shores. And in addition, even more seriously, that it was directed against a particular group of people. The Chinese were the first ever to be excluded, and individually, their group of people was excluded. Now, in order to give you a little background on the coming of the Chinese Exclusion Act, I have to go back to something called the Chinese Educational Mission. The Chinese Educational Mission was a society and a building that appeared in Connecticut, in Hartford, in 1872. So in 1872, the building went up, and we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Chinese Educational Mission. The mission was located on Collins Street, and unfortunately, it's been knocked to the ground. The building itself has been knocked to the ground. It was a 3-story building, and all that we know about it, right, and there's a picture of it on the screen. All we know about it today is that it is part of the parking lot of, or the parking system of St. Francis Hospital. But it did exist. It was put up in 1872. The educational mission was the brainchild of a man named Young Wing. Now, who is Young Wing? He was the first Chinese graduate of Yale University. He came to this country in 1850. He became a regular student at Yale in 1850 and graduated with the class of 1854. So he himself had been part of a program that was a private program that was started in China to assist Chinese in their perhaps learning more about the United States, want to learn about a different culture. He was supported in coming to Yale in 1850. Then graduated in 1854 from the USA, from a school in the USA, and he went back to China. And by the way, Yale still has the same link that Young Wing started. And if you go down Temple Street, New Haven, you're going to see a building with a sign that says Yale China Center on it. And that's some remnant of Young Wing's having studied here. Well, he returned to China, Young Wing did, and he was a very knowledgeable in English, very fluent in English. And so he helped. One of the first things he did to earn money was that he did translations for people that needed translations from Chinese into English. But he also became a businessman, and he had trade. He was involved with trade between China and the United States. And all along, he had this dream. He wanted to start a school along the lines of what he had done, that he would, or these young men from China would come to, as it turned out, to Hartford and would study here. And he realized his dream in 1872. He received permission of the Chinese government and also the US government to start a school in Hartford, which we now call the Chinese Educational Mission. These were young men that came from China to the educational mission, and some of them studied right in this building here that we see, but they also studied at Hartford High School. And there's a building, a history room at the new Hartford High School that has materials collected about the Chinese students that came to the Chinese Educational Mission. These students graduated. They were successful learning about US culture, but they returned to China, and China benefited. One of them is legendarily known as the railroad builder, and he was involved in helping develop all sorts of rail transportation through China. Others became involved in politics and became involved in the Chinese government. Years later, a speaker in Hartford, I think it was 1929, came to Hartford and made an address, and he said, in Hartford, the Chinese Revolution began. So the Chinese exclusionary or educational mission was very successful, and the students learned about our culture. They also had fun. They played baseball, and as Jen was mentioning, the Connecticut Historical Society has a wonderful exhibit right now showing photos of these Chinese educational mission students. And there were letters written by these students back to a home in Chinese. And these letters have been specially translated for this exhibit. And I think Jen's going to tell you more about some programs that are coming up involving the letters. Now, Young Wing, in founding the school, was very close to a man, a local Connecticut minister or Hartford minister by the name of Joseph Twitchell. And he was the reverend, the minister for the Asylum Hill Congregational Church. You actually go, which exists today. If you go into the church, you're also going to see plaques and information on the relationship between Joseph Twitchell and young Wing. Twitchell lived in what we call Nook Farm. Nook Farm was a literary community right off Farmington Avenue, and Twitchell got his friends to help young Wing. Mark Twain was one of Twitchell's closest friends. There was also Charles Dudley Warner. You know, Charles Dudley Warner came to Hartford and wrote a book with Mark Twain called The Gilded Age. And Joseph Hooker was also in Nook Farm. He was married to Isabella Beecher, who was a sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe also built a home in Nook Farm, and she didn't always live at Nook Farm, but she was for part of her life, and she too was helpful. Now, these spouses and their husbands, Nook Farm people, were all thrilled when young Wing decided to marry a woman, Mary Kellogg, her name was, and they got married at the Asylum Hill Congregational Church with Twitchell presiding. So there was a nice relationship between the school, the educational mission, Nook Farm, Twitchell. A lot of the people knew the students. They knew the different teachers of these students. Some of them were Chinese, and they knew them. Things were going well until 1881, when everything collapsed. In 1881, as we'll see, the idea of excluding the Chinese from the country, from the USA, began to arise in local legislation, that is in the states, and also in Congress. And the Chinese officials who had authorized the creation of the educational mission were reluctant to send their young men to a country that had negative attitude, or saying very negative things about the Chinese. So the school ended in 1881. This negative attitude towards Chinese and the height of the legislation occurred because many of the Chinese who came from China to the West Coast, to California, were used in constructing the transcontinental railroads. By 1881, or a few years earlier, this had been completed, and the Chinese were turning to those that decided to stay here after being laborers on the building of the transcontinental railroad. These workers were seen as leeches, as taking over the jobs of, quote, white people. And Congress joined in with the discrimination that the Western states were proposing, especially California, to try and work out a way to exclude the Chinese from this country. Now, the Southern states were all for this as well. The Southern states had their own problems. They had just had people who were slaves, and the Black slaves were now free and entering in the Reconstruction period, were entering their economy, and were asking for political rights. And the Southerners were uncomfortable with that kind of thing, and finding ways to exclude the newly freed slaves. So they were very happy to think about proposals from California in our U.S. legislature, U.S. Congress, to exclude Chinese from coming to the West Coast. The northern states, however, were more favorable to the Chinese, and the New England states were as well. Now, there are some that say, oh, they were just interested in opening up more trade with China. But if you listen to what they were saying, it was more than that. They were looking to political rights and to civil rights of the Chinese. So in Connecticut, you see a lot of interest in opposing these exclusionary acts. Connecticut's two senators, the Senate in those days was the center of foreign policy. The president had little to do with it. The House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, had little to do with it. So the Senate is where the action was, where the rules of law that were adopted by the full Congress were planned out and developed. So Connecticut's two senators led the fight against the exclusion legislation. And one of them was a man named Joseph Roswell Hawley, who I'll get into in a minute. And he was a neighbor and parishioner of Minister Twitchell. And then there was a second fellow by the name of Orville Platt. He was a second. So you had Hawley and Platt. And I also, when I wrote this up as a full article, put in a person by the name of George Frisbie Hoar. Now, he was Massachusetts representative, U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. But he was a grandson of Roger Sherman. His mother was Roger Sherman's daughter. And Roger Sherman was a famous Connecticut man. He's a founding father. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He signed the Articles of Confederation. He signed the U.S. Constitution. So Roger Sherman was actually linked to from Connecticut in a big way. And why shouldn't we look at George Frisbie Hoar as having this connection to Connecticut as well? Now, these senators, as I say, opposed the acts of Congress in putting together the Chinese Exclusion Act. They knew these Chinese people from the Education Commission, the students, the teachers. They interacted with them. Again, the California idea was that the Chinese were taking away native jobs. And of course, like any other economy, up went the economy of California sometimes, or sometimes it dipped. And the opponents of Chinese said that the people were Chinese were there to cheat people. They were there for a short time. They were ripping people off, and then they go back to China. And the opponents of the Chinese met in what they called the sand lots throughout California, these large sand open areas. And they'd have a spokesman get up and yell out, "The Chinese must go." And the states began to pass the Californian area, or Seattle or whatever up the coast. They enacted local legislation that was exclusionary, perhaps how they could vote, whether Chinese could vote, whether they could open businesses, how they had to dress. And there was a pressure beyond just the local or the West Coast area to get this legislation in Congress, and let Congress pass laws for the whole country. Well, I want to get into the acts that they passed, this Exclusion Act. But first, let me tell you something about the three people that I claim to be. Two were U.S. senators from Connecticut, and one is the man I adopt as a semi-Connecticut person. The first I want to talk about is Joseph Roswell Hawley. Now, Hawley was born in North Carolina in 1826, but his father was actually a minister on the move, a roving minister. So the father and Hawley returned to Connecticut and to Hartford area, and that's where Hawley spent his early teenage years. Then he went to Cazenovia, New York, where Hamilton College is located. And he was a Hamilton College graduate in 1847. He was a smart student. He was well liked as a debater, things of that nature. And the first thing he did was he taught school for a little while, but then he was studying for the bar. And he qualified for the Connecticut bar and moved back to Connecticut, to Hartford. And he joined a law firm that was run by John Hooker. Now, as I mentioned, John Hooker was Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother-in-law. Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister, Isabella, was married to John Hooker. So both Isabella and John Hooker were very active in causes and freeing slaves and the suffrage movement. And Hawley himself became part of this family. He married a cousin of the Beechers, so he married into the family. Now, Joseph Roswell Hawley, as I said, he had a legal degree, but he wasn't interested in civil practice and collections and whatever lawyers were doing at the time. His interest was in politics. And in 1858, the Republican Party had a big success in the US Congress and was pinned down as a full party for the United States. And in each state, a Republican Party was formed. And the Republican Party of Connecticut was founded in Hawley's office. So they favored, of course, Abraham Lincoln. They had what they called wide awake parades, and they marched through the streets with a sign that said Hawley, our champion. In the meanwhile, another way that one furthered your political goals was to start a newspaper. And Hawley started something which he called the Hartford Evening Press. And gradually, the Hartford Evening Press expanded and expanded, and it bought up the name Hartford Courant. So really, Hawley was the founder of what we know as the Hartford Courant. Of course, it's changed hands and ownerships today, but he was the founder of the Hartford Courant, and he wrote, even when he was in the US Senate, he wrote editorials for the Hartford Courant. I guess he must have telegraphed them down so that if you opened up the Courant, you found the exact same position that Hawley took when he was a US Senator. And he lived in New Farm as well. And he knew the Chinese people very well from the Chinese educational mission. And Hawley, the legend is he was sitting at his desk at the Hartford Courant. The Civil War had started. He threw down his pen and he turned to Charles Dudley Warner, his associate, and said, "You're going to be in charge of the Courant. I'm going to form a group." And he formed a military group called Hawley's Rangers, and they went in to fight in the Civil War. Well, he stayed in the war through till the end as a figure of war, and at the end of the war, he came out of with the rank of a general. So here was Hawley. He was fighting Joe Hawley, who had been a hero of the war. He owned the Hartford Courant. He became governor of Connecticut for 2 years, 1866 to 1868. But then he was voted out, went back to the Hartford Courant and worked with the Hartford Courant. In 1876, he was chosen as the executive director of a celebration they had in Philadelphia. They celebrated the 100th year of the US government. And he brought the Chinese students down to see the exhibit as well. And he brought Mark Twain down there too. So, Hawley entered the House of Representatives off and on. He won, he lost, went back to the Hartford Courant. But by 1880, he was in the US Senate, and he was called upon as an orator on 4th of July. If you need something of the 4th of July speech, there was Hawley making his speech, kept up the Courant as well. And one of his things that he did since he was a general was that he helped the US become part of the battles of the Spanish-American War. And Hawley, still owning the Courant, died in 1905. He was also in the US Senate in 1905. So that's Hawley. Now I'll come to the next fellow who was a US Senator from Connecticut, Orville Hitchcock Platt. He was born in Washington, Connecticut in 1827, but Washington is near Meriden, and he had very ties to Meriden, Connecticut. In 1850, became a member of the Connecticut Bar. He was tall, bony, gave a nice appearance. He's over 6 foot tall. Now he did not, Hawley, I said, was not interested in being a practicing lawyer. He wanted to get into politics. Platt, on the other hand, was your traditional Connecticut lawyer. he wasn't flashy. He wasn't a big politician. He liked to play baseball and get involved in the local community. And he did what normally lawyers did in those days. He was involved with Connecticut Yankee tinkerers and made little extra money on the side as the judge of probate of Meriden. At one point, he was a clerk of the state Senate. Another time, he entered the House, U.S. House of Representatives, the Connecticut House of Representatives, was Speaker of the House. He was Secretary of the State for a little while, State's Attorney for a little while. So these are all little things that he did in addition to being a regular lawyer. And his political thinking was he joined something which was nationally known as the Know Nothing Party. In Connecticut was known as the American Party, which was a bit of a racist thing, but he got out of it when the Republican Party was formed. He became a member of the Republican Party. He also wanted to be in the U.S. Senate. In 1878, he was in a battle with Hawley. Now, if you remember, it was only after we passed the 17th Amendment, which was after World War I, that senators were elected just like they are today off the ballot. Back then, it was caucus by caucus. Each Democrat had a caucus, Republicans had a caucus. Whichever controlled the legislature, your caucus chose the senator. And of course, in Connecticut, we're very dominated by the Republicans. So whoever won the caucus would become the U.S. Senator. And in 1878, everyone said, well, Hawley's going to become the U.S. Senator. He's going to lead the caucus. But what happened was something called a midnight caucuses. Unexpectedly, Platt won that caucus. So in 1878, he came in over Hawley. And the newspapers at the time said, oh, Platt will be a backbencher. This is a shock. They didn't choose a wonderful Hawley. They picked this know-nothing Platt to be U.S. Senator. The opposite came true. Hawley became less and less active. Perhaps it was some speculate he was tired after being in the military for 4 years, had the pressures of being a soldier. Platt became very, very important in the U.S. Senate. You know, we've all heard of the Platt Amendment, which had to deal with how Cuban properties would be handled, of real properties that we seized during the Spanish-American War. And he was considered one of the top senators. Both Hawley and Platt had term after term. They each won their caucuses when their names came up. And they were both senators in 1905. Hawley decided he wouldn't run again. He was tired. He was going to quit. Then he died. And Platt went to his funeral, caught pneumonia at Hawley's funeral, and he died too. So they both died in 1905. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the time of Platt's death, called Platt the best man in the Senate. He was more practical than Hawley, and he came up with practical solutions. And by 1905, now when he died, he was controlling quite a bit of political and policy making for foreign affairs. Now, the man I grab, probably somebody would say I'm nuts, but I like the fact that Hoar could be considered a Connecticut person. George Frisbie Hoar was born in Massachusetts in 1826. He was a patrician from a very wealthy family. He went to Harvard undergraduate school, Harvard Law School, but his mother was the daughter of Roger Sherman, as I say, who was a Connecticut hero and one of the few founding fathers that signed all the founding documents. And Hoar continued his ties to Connecticut. He was proud of his Connecticut relations. And there was a relation that became a governor at some point. He wrote an autobiography where he claimed that he had a lot of Connecticut ties. So I'm going to go out on a limb and call him a Connecticut tie, or tied into some Connecticut opposition to the Chinese Exclusion Act. One of the interesting things I found about Hoar actually was that he was one of the few senators that was pro-women's rights. So he was also interested in the rights not only of immigration, but of helping women to get ahead. In 1900, that was a pretty rare thing. And he always voted in favor of Chinese immigration and against these congressional restrictions. He was in the U.S. House by 1872 and the U.S. Congress by U.S. Senate by 1877, and he died in 1904. He was an excellent orator. If you looked at George Frisbie Hoar, you thought you were looking at a lovable Mr. Pickwick, the popular Pickwick papers right around that time. But he was very prickly. He was certainly not what he looked like. He was very prickly and sharp. He hated the Democrats. Anything that he could do to restrict the Democrats, he would do. And he was very annoyed with the mugwumps who had voted for Cleveland and not James G. Blaine in 1884. And he addressed one of his old friends, that a Republican. He said, "I had hoped to see you again in heaven, but now I never will." Now, he was against the Spanish-American War. Hoar always talked about a vision of Miss America smiling and holding her arms out in welcome, not angry, not an angry American, but a smiling American. Now, let's talk for a bit of these three people and how they opposed the various acts that they didn't succeed in stopping. Now, actually, the first particular effort that the California group and the Southerners put forward was in 1878. It was called the 15 Passenger Act. The act required the captain of a ship coming to the United States to count the number of Chinese on board, and there had to be 15 or less persons on board that were of Chinese origin, and there were criminal penalties and fines imposed for such violations. Of course, the West and the South favored the 15 Passenger Act. An interesting person that was also in favor of the act was James G. Blaine, who ran for president in 1884. He was from Maine, but he was still one of his claims to success was that he was against Chinese. Now, when the act came up in 1878, the 15 Passenger Act, Platt was in opposition, didn't make a large address or make any long statement. Platt said that he didn't think it was a fair act. It was racially motivated. Hawley was not even in the Senate at the time, as we saw. He didn't come in until 1880 or March the 4th of 1881, actually. Hoar, as was common for all his speeches on this topic, was violently opposed to the 15 Passenger Act. It was an offense to the Declaration of Independence and would lead to disaster for the nation. Of course, they again failed, and the Senate adopted the 15 Passenger Act 39-7, and it was even more favorably received by the U.S. House of Representatives. So the next question is, would the acting president, Rutherford B. Hayes, would he veto the bill? And California put a lot of pressure. California representatives in Congress put a lot of pressure on Hayes to sign the bill. Hawley at the time, as I said, was not in Congress, but he was the owner of the Hartford Courant, and his editorials were very strongly in favor of veto. Several other Hartford people opposed the signing of the 15 Passenger Act, including P.T. Barnum, who was living in Hartford at the time, and said that the Chinese had a soul like everyone else. And of course, Twitchell, the Reverend Joseph Twitchell, was very much against the 15 Passenger Act. On March the 1st, 1879, Hayes vetoed the bill. He said he couldn't sign it because we needed a new treaty between the U.S. and China. Connecticut praised and Current praised this result, and it was noted by the New York Times that Hartford Current and other Hartford figures had led the fight for the veto, and Hayes was burned in effigy in the West. Now we come to the year 1882. Hayes set up a committee to go back to China and renegotiate a treaty, which is what they did. Now, the treaty called for the U.S., if they wanted to pass a 10-year exclusion of the Chinese from the United States. For some reason or other, Congress immediately enacted a 20-year ban on the exclusion of the Chinese, with some exceptions. And the president at the time was Chester A. Arthur. He vetoed the bill and said it violated the treaty. So the Congress went back and took up a 10-year exclusion. Of course, you have the West and the South supporting this with success. Our senators, Platt, said that it still violated the treaty. He wouldn't go for the 10-year period of exclusion, that it was racist. It was to keep those from China and freed slaves from earning a living. And there was the whole intent of the bill benefited whites only. And Hawley said, and of course this is Hawley writing in his editorial and also saying the same thing in the U.S. floor of the U.S. Senate, I plant myself here and now, this moment, on the ground of unconditional hostility and denunciation. And he repeats this in the Current. And Hawley got several letters from people throughout Connecticut thanking him, including the Chinese scholars here from the Chinese Educational Mission. Unfortunately, their opposition did no good. But I wanted to read to you a little bit of what Hoar said. And actually, I'm going to read this, Hoar's opposition, or section of Hoar's opposition to the 1882 Act, because it's similar to what he said in 1878 with the 15 Passenger Act and some of these other bills that were proposed after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Mr. Miller of California had introduced the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act by saying that the Chinese were shifty, they were unreliable, they were looking to take American jobs away. And this is what Hoar said in reply. I will not detain the Senate by reading the abundant testimony, of which this is but a sample, of the possession by the people of this race, that is Chinese race, of the possibility for the development of every quality of intellect, art, character, and fits them for citizenship, for republicanism, and for Christianity. Humanity, capable of infinite depths of degradation, is also of infinite heights of excellence. The Chinese, like all other races, has given us its examples of both. To rescue humanity from this degradation is, we are taught to believe, the great object of God's moral government on earth. It is not by injustice, exclusion, caste, but by reverence for the individual soul that we can aid in this consummation. It is not by Chinese policies that Chinese is to be civilized. I believe that the immortal truths of the Declaration of Independence came from the same source which the Golden Rule and the Sermon on the Mount. We can trust him who promulgated these laws to keep the country safe that obeys them. The laws of the universe have their own sanction. They will not fail. The power that causes the compass to point to the north, that dismisses the star on its pathway through the skies, promising that in 1,000 years it shall return again true to its hour and keeps his word, will vindicate his own moral law. As surely as the path on which our fathers entered 100 years ago led to safety, to strength, to glory, so surely will the path on which we now propose to enter bring us to shame, to weakness, and to peril. That's what he said. Nobody went for it, however. And the act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, was adopted in 1882. Went back to Chester A. Arthur again, which he had vetoed the 20-year exclusion, but he didn't veto this. He signed the 10-year exclusion of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And we have a cartoon which shows a couple before. There we go. There's Chester A. Arthur. He's throwing, and this is from Puck magazine, which always had negative pictures of the people they were against. He's throwing some little meat to the Chinese, to the people opposing the Chinese from the Western states and some of the others, while hiding behind his back is something which says a second term. He's looking for second term as president, and the globe up ahead shows the White House, and he's going to take advantage of that. So he went for the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the act dates from 1882. Then they had all these little, semi-little bills that came after the 1882 Act. It was actually the 1882 Act that controlled. In 1884, there was an act that made some corrections so that the Chinese couldn't travel to Hong Kong and then to the United States, get around the act. And there we have Hawley praising the opposition in the Hartford Current. There's some thought that Hawley was going to run for president of the United States, and so he was cooling some of his rhetoric. In 1884, the Congress voted in favor of an act that was called the Scott Act. The Scott Act, again, you had Platt and Hawley didn't put any votes in opposition, but they issued statements opposing the Scott Act, or of course continued to vote in opposition based upon that same passage that I read for you. And the Scott Act was required those Chinese who had left the United States, they needed a certificate in order to return to the United States, and that was usually not given. In 1892, which was a 10-year anniversary, they had to readopt the Exclusion Act, which they did. It was called the Gary Act. If you go out to California and San Francisco, you see there's a Elbridge Gary Street, or Gary Street, which is named for Elbridge Gary. He actually ended up going to Alaska after this, but they were all very much in favor of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this act actually required all Chinese in the United States to register. And Platt again voted against it, and Hawley attacked and voted against it and attacked the Gary Act in the Hartford Current. In 1902, which was the third renewal of the act itself, Platt took over, and the act was very restrictive and expansive, and Platt, while opposing it, limited the act to its original language. And again, Hawley praised Platt in the Hartford Current for his actions. By 1905, all three of these people were dead. Hawley and Platt died in 1905. Hoar died in 1904. They were opponents, and they failed to stop the rush to exclude the Chinese. That they were dead, but there was worse legislation coming by 1924, that something called the Johnson Act had passed, which limited immigration from both Eastern Europe and Asia. If you look at Mein Kampf, Hitler actually praised the Johnson Act and said the U.S. had done the right thing. These three men had failed, in fact, to stop the legislation, but they did eventually produce a tangible result, because in the middle of World War II, we were trying to help China, and it was seen that the Japanese had invaded China, were ruling over China, and we were making all these political statements and statements about how we wanted to help get China back on its feet again. Yet at the same time, we were keeping them out of the United States, denying them rights of citizenship, things of that nature. So a committee was set up, chaired by Pearl Buck, who recommended that in 1943, all these Chinese Exclusion Acts be repealed. And this was done in 1943. There's something called the Magnuson Act, a name for Warren Magnuson, that repealed the Chinese Exclusion Acts. Now, as they have in many of these bill signings, they have a ceremony. And Franklin Roosevelt came to the ceremony to sign the Magnuson Act. And our three senators that I'm talking about today would have agreed with the remarks of Franklin Roosevelt at the ceremonial signing. This is what he said about the Chinese Exclusion Acts. We should wipe from the statute books those anachronisms of our law, which forbid the immigration of the Chinese people into this country, which barred Chinese residents from American citizenship. Nations, like individuals, make mistakes. We must be big enough to acknowledge our mistakes of the past and to correct them. Thank you. Jennifer, you want to take over and see if there's anybody that has some questions?
Thank you so much, Judge Cohn. That was amazing. Thank you. Wonderful. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. I can read those out loud. Certainly, you could unmute yourself. That's another option, and ask your question. We'll give everyone some time to type away or unmute. While we're waiting, I will say, who funded the Chinese Educational Center?
Well, I think Young Wing did. You're talking about the educational mission?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was done by Young Wing, and he would have had Connecticut people here that supported it, and some philanthropists naturally did as well.
And the Chinese government as well
Well, they did to a degree. They allowed, there was some problems with the government at that time. There were some revolutionary things going on, and Young Wing had to work with the people that were governing China and get them to go along with it. So they certainly supported the mission. Whether how much they gave to cover expenses, I really don't know.
We have Linda mentioned that she's a descendant of one of the Chinese students. I'm sorry, Chu Zhaoyu, and she really appreciates the fact that perhaps he met the senators when he was here. That's great.
They wrote to him. The senators were on the floor of the Senate making speeches against the Exclusion Act, and they got letters from the students and from the professors that taught at the school or used to teach at the school, and they helped with. They had actually worked on some Chinese language a discussion of maybe a dictionary or something of that nature. And one of the professors wrote to both Hoar and Hawley about how wrong this exclusion was.
Right. Anybody else have any questions or comments today for Judge Cohn? Anybody? I have someone asking, did most of the immigrants for the railroad leave or become citizens? Do you know?
As best I can tell, most of them stayed. That's what caused the problem, because they were there and the Chinese didn't like them. Excuse me, the Californian population didn't like them there.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Judge Cohn, you've written a paper on this topic, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
a few
we do.
years ago.
Okay.
I wrote on that. I had a co-author who was Chinese, and we really put a lot together on it. Mostly the speeches. Back in the maybe the 1920s, there was a man that did a full report on this as well. I don't have the note here to tell you his name, but he was he wrote a long book on this too, which we used a lot from.
Can people gain access to that? Is there
Yes,
they can find that?
Yeah, if anybody wants to, I'll tell you the name of the article. It's very, very interesting. Actually, it's easy to find. Hawley. When Hawley gave his speech, he went all out. He really let it fly. And that's one of the things that he used to do when he was invited to go up to Litchfield or go to some 4th of July presentation to dedicate a cemetery. And he would yell out, "No, no, no, no," when he would say, is this what we want to have as our country? And do we want to have this ban on immigration and so forth? He would say, no, 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 no. So actually, the title of my article the long paper that I wrote is called No, 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 Chinese Exclusion Act. And anybody that Googles that, 4 no's is going to find it.
Grant is adding in that the Naturalization Act of 1790 only allowed free white persons to become citizens. And then, of course, that changed with the 14th Amendment, but Chinese couldn't naturalize until 1943.
Right.
When those exclusion acts were repealed.
Mm-hmm.
And then other places were at different times. Is your paper on this available on the line, or is it something you could provide me and I can send to people?
It was actually published by a group at the University of Connecticut Law School, where they never put anything in the form of a hard paper. Everything they did was online. I think it's some kind of civil rights group that accepted it, and that's what we used. And but the easiest way to do it is to look for this repetition of 4 no's in the title with my name. It should come right up.
I can certainly search for that, and I will be, because today's program was recorded, I will send everyone here today, and anyone that couldn't make it today, I will send them the link when the recording is uploaded to our YouTube page. I can also I can look for this link to the article and I can send that as well. That would be easy enough to do. Yeah, any other questions for anybody today? Well, we are just about out of time. Thank you so much, Judge Cohn. This was really interesting.
It was an honor to be here.
This was wonderful. I do want to tell everyone about some upcoming programs that we have. We do have one more that is something upcoming next month in a couple of weeks that also supports the Chinese educational mission. But what we do have, our next Lunch and Learn is next Tuesday. Usually they're once a month or every couple of weeks, but we have another one next week. This is called My Dearest Darling. This is a very interesting topic. Lisa Franco discovered some letters written between Donald and Marjorie while he was at war. And she put together a book called My Dearest Darling, Letters of Love in Wartime. And so she'll really talk to us in our presentation about the discovery and about her research for the book. And she'll really shine a light on the sacrifices overseas and, of course, at home as well during World War II. And then we have another virtual program on April 12th. This is an evening program, though. Henry Cohn, who contributed to his research and his translation skills to our exhibition on Journeys, the Boys of the Chinese Educational Mission. He's going to be presenting on the 12th the story of three students, three brothers, the Shu brothers, and he'll talk a little bit about their lives. So that's another one that supports this exhibit. We hope you will attend. And then we have a trivia night that is on site on Thursday, April 20th. And so our other exhibit that we have currently is the bicycle game. And you'll learn a little bit about bicycle history, but you can also play the game. So our trivia night is based on a little bit on our exhibit, but also just games of all kinds. And so that are just some upcoming events that we have going on. Of course, you can check out our website, chs.org, for any other programs that we have coming up, whether they're virtual or on site. And thank you very much, Henry. There's lots of thank yous in the chat right now. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we will see you again, hopefully next Tuesday, the 4th. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye now.